Hi everyone, it's Kathy, and today I'll be sharing a Slimline shaker card, but instead of using the typical shaker bits, I decided to use the small banana stamp from the Monkey Do stamp set by Paperie Ink for my shaker bits. I'll also be using the Toucan Party stamp set, as well as the new 5 frames Slimline die from Whimsy stamps. I stamped the images onto a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock using Catherine Pooler's Midnight ink. Both the cardstock and the ink are alcohol marker friendly, and of course I'll be doing some coloring with my Copics. I almost said coloring with my comics. Anyway, for the branch I started out with my darkest color, which is E47, and I colored that along the bottom of the branch so that it would be darker. Then I came in with E35 and E33 to finish up the branch. I colored the second branch the same way, except that I reversed the colors. So I actually did the darkest color on the top of the branch, because in the finished card I'm going to flip that branch over so the top will then become the bottom. Then I remembered that since I wanted to run it through my scan and cut machine to cut it out, that I needed to add a closed line on the end of those branches. So I just used a fine tip black marker for that. For the leaves, I used YG17 and YG03, and I kept the coloring really simple for this card. The images are pretty tiny, so you don't need to use a whole bunch of different colors. And then I'm going to say, with the exception of the monkeys, I did end up using quite a few different browns for that. For the bananas, I started out with E25 and just did a tiny little line up at the top part of the stem, and then I blended that out with the E23. For the bananas, I used Y15, Y08, and Y13 to color them in. I concentrated the Y15 on the larger curved part of the banana, and then I moved in with the other colors towards the center of the banana. For the banana bunch, I made sure to keep the darkest color where the bananas overlapped, just so that there would be sort of a shadow there. And then after I was done with that, I wanted to add a little bit of green at the tops of the bananas, so I came in with YG03 and added just a tiny little bit of that at the very, very top. I am only going to share how I colored one of the monkeys because I used all of the same colors on each of them, and I pretty much did the same technique. I started out with E25 and added that where the areas would be darkest on the monkey. Again, I'm not really going for a light source. I'm going more for where there would be shadows. After I was done with the E25, I came in with the E23 and blended that out just a little bit, and I added some to either side of his little face. I did leave quite a bit of white space on his little tush so that there would be somewhat of a highlight there. After the E23, I came in with E33 and blended that out. After I was done with that, I moved on to his forehead, and as I was flicking upwards with the E23, I realized that my E25 was kind of faded out and I lost those shadows. So I came in with E27 just to darken up those shadows a little bit, especially around the back of his ear and then where his paw is underneath his chin and the back side of his little tush again. Then I decided that the sides of his face and the top of his head needed to be a little bit darker, so I used E25 for that. And I blended out the E27 that I had put on his body just because those lines were a little bit harsh. Then I finished coloring in the top of his head with the E23. For his little face, I started with E53 and I added that around the outer edges of his face, and then I blended that out with E51. I also colored in his ears with the same two colors. After I was done coloring in his face, I came in with the E25 to color in his nose. Then I decided that his ears needed to be a little bit more brown, so I used the E23 for that. And then I added a little bit of pink to the center of his ears with R20, and then I added tiny little dots on his cheeks to give him some blushed cheeks. After I was done with all of the coloring, I started to work on the bits and pieces for my Slimline card. I used the 5 frames die from Whimsy Stamps and cut it once from white cardstock and once from yellow cardstock. I had also cut a piece of green cardstock down to just slightly smaller than 3 1/4 by 8 1/2, and I taped the white frame in place and used a pencil so that I could trace on the inside of those frames. Then I grabbed one of the inner frames and put it into place and traced on the inside of that because that's where I'm going to have my sentiment go. I wanted to add a pattern to that green cardstock that would show through the windows of the card after I was done putting it together. So I used the leaves from the Toucan Party stamp set with Lime Rickey ink from Catherine Pooler, and I stamped both the outline image as well as the solid image, and I just randomly stamped it, and the reason that I drew the frames was so that I would know where I needed to do the stamping and not necessarily have to stamp any more than I had to. Next, I used my embossing bag to treat the inner frame that I had traced so that I could stamp and emboss my sentiment. I used VersaMark ink to stamp the sentiment, and then I coated it with detail white embossing powder, and then heat set it with my heat tool, which I did have heating up off to the side so that it would be nice and hot to melt that powder a little bit faster. After I had all of the stamping and the coloring done, I started to put my card together. So the yellow frame is going to be the outer frame, and I used 1/8 inch score tape around the outside of that frame so that I could adhere a piece of acetate to the back side of that for my shaker windows. Off screen, I stamped and colored a whole bunch more of those bananas so that I could use them as my shaker bits, and I did cut the images out using my scan and cut machine. Anyway, after I adhered the piece of acetate to the back side of my yellow frame, I trimmed off the excess acetate, and then I grabbed my liquid glue and the white frames, and then I remembered that I wanted to have the branch hidden behind the frame, so I put a tiny little dot of glue on the back side and held the branch in place just for a little while so that it wouldn't move when I went to put it into place on the actual yellow frame. When I put that first frame in, I had a little bit of glue squish out of the side, so I just used my fingernail to scrape that up. But if you end up with a lot of glue on acetate, you can use a piece of a paper towel or a Q-tip with some rubbing alcohol, and it'll lift up that glue without a problem. Then I moved on to adhering in the second frame, and wait for it. All of a sudden I realized that I messed up on my green background. I put my sentiment in the wrong frame. So to fix that, all I had to do was cut apart that green piece of cardstock with the stamping. Luckily, I hadn't erased the pencil lines, so I knew exactly where I needed to cut. So I trimmed down the piece with the sentiment so that it would fit within the frame on the front of the card, and then the other pieces, I trimmed those down so that I could fit them on the back side behind the window of the frame. I admit I panicked a little bit when I realized what I had done, but then I thought, this is a really easy fix. All I have to do is just cut that green panel apart and make sure that they fit within the windows, which they did. After I had the green panel cut apart, I grabbed some 1/4 inch foam tape, which I found out about from my friend Marla, and purchased it from scrapbook.com. And it's the perfect width for this slimline die. It covers the frame on the outer edge as well as the inside frame perfectly with no overhang. And I'll make sure to have everything that I used as well as the Copic colors that I used listed down in the description box below. So I put the foam tape all the way around the edges, and then I also put strips of foam tape in between the windows and made where the bananas were going to be, and made sure that there was a pretty tight contact between the sides to make sure that my little bananas didn't fall out. When using stamped images for your shaker bits, you want to make sure that you put them face down if you're working from the back side of the card to make sure that they're facing the correct way when you flip the card over. Anyway, after I had my bananas put in the spot where they needed to be, I removed the release paper from the foam tape, and then I gathered up my green pieces of cardstock and put them into place. I used liquid glue to adhere my monkeys and the sentiment to the front of the card. And then I trimmed off the excess green cardstock down at the bottom. I just used my scissors for that. And then I used liquid glue to adhere my shaker panel to the front of my note card, which is from 80-pound Neenah Classic Crest cardstock. I cut it to 8.5 by 7, and then I folded it at 3.5 inches on the 7-inch side. So the finished card size is 3.5 by 8.5. And I decided that I needed to have something on the left side of the sentiment, so I colored up another bunch of bananas, and for that one I just fussy cut it with my scissors because it was only one little image. I used liquid glue to adhere that into place, and that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.